I get started. And indeed, as Hannes was suggesting, I would like to tell you a little bit about a workshop that our Janus Verein was organizing, also on behalf of the ITAS in Karlsruhe, which is the Institute for Technology Assessment in Karlsruhe. So they were kind of asking us to put together this group of people to discuss in a rather informal way the question, science and engineering for peace. Are we dealing here with an idea that is in some ways failing? And of course, given how many people are assembled here today, it doesn't seem like it's failing. It seems like it has a strong advocacy. But science and engineering for peace, this idea that it might that this might be an endangered or idea, I will try to motivate why I'm saying this, is prompted our getting together. In other words, there is a kind of suspicion that the academic community as a whole, the scientific community at large, is perhaps not sufficiently concerned to stand up for certain kind of traditional values of science and technology and engineering. And we wonder why this is. And we are a bit disheartened by that fact. And we are trying to, in some ways, remind ourselves of the historical values and traditions of science and engineering, which in some sense almost obligate us towards this notion of science and engineering for peace. So there is a bit of skepticism that prompts the discussion, but at the same time also kind of optimism to find answers that can invigorate perhaps our resolve in some ways. So and this is, of course, you might say I'm preaching to the converted today, so it's perhaps not something that will surprise you very much. If I think there might still be a value in this, it is also maybe to play it off the very, very good statement that was produced for the CERN Courier, the statement that was published last week, the one that Hannes was referring to, and in some ways, of course, there is complete agreement about the thrust of this statement, but we were looking for arguments that go a little bit further, or maybe a little deeper, and that might also be much more general. That also appeal, of course, to other fields of science and engineering, including the humanities. And the statement that Hannes was referring to foregrounds, on the one hand, the terrific success stories we have from international scientific collaborations, like the collaborations at CERN or DESY or other sort of large international sites for research, and it, at the same time, also really reflected in a very concrete way on the sense and nonsense and the kind of efficacy and meaning of these sanctions as they concern science, whether or not these sanctions are in some sense misplaced or just dysfunctional when it comes to the sphere of science, and indeed I agree that with this statement, in the sense, and we all agreed in Koblenz at our meeting in Koblenz with the thrust of the statement, as far as it is not a matter of questioning sanctions and the political positioning of Europe towards Russia in general. I mean, I think we are not going to have, or we don't need to have, a big political debate today, but I think I'll be very clear to say that I basically agree with the policies of my government, for example, but that we kind of have to ask whether there needs to be some kind of differentiation, whether there is a specific role, especially for science and scientific research and also education, and that this role should not be sort of, and the contribution of science should not be sacrificed for the sake of this political struggle. In fact, that it can be productive and important to move us forward beyond the current crisis or and division. So that's why we try to start in our discussions to kind of work out a little bit what does this sort of peacemaking role of science and engineering really consist in? What is it rooted in? Why are we sort of almost professionally obligated towards it by making a decision to become scientists? Have we already, in some sense, decided to work towards a kind of in a peaceful way and also in a peace-promoting way? So to work this out and make it explicit was perhaps the larger ambition. And you might say it should be unnecessary to do that, but unfortunately, it's not unnecessary. I've been preparing a little bit of a text that might also become some kind of editorial or statement somewhere to be published. We are still discussing it also among ourselves. And we are maybe not in enough of a hurry to get it out, even though I think it should be out in maybe a couple of weeks. And so I've been working on a text, and I will kind of take you through some of this. But again, I don't also want to talk too long, and I want to be sure. So maybe I'll try to stick to another 10 minutes or so, and then leave it at that, and then just open it up for your comments. So. One starting point is actually to look at a slogan that is kind of getting popular again today, and it's actually the slogan decorates right now the university in Darmstadt. We have it it's like a banner over the portals of the university, and the slogan says that science needs democracy. And democracy needs science. Wissenschaft braucht Demokratie, Demokratie braucht Wissenschaft. Now, of course, why do we have the slogan over the portals of the university? It's not because of any of the wars that are going on in the world, neither the Russian invasion of Ukraine nor the conflict in the Israel-Palestine conflict. But of course, the reason why it's there is because in Germany right now, we are trying to make sure that we distance ourselves from anti-democratic right-wing political movements. And so this was a statement to say that these sort of right-wingers, anti-democratic right-wingers, have no place in science, and also they may not hope for the support from science. So this is, I think, what this is trying to say. And I think on that level, it's just like a very good sounding slogan, and it seems like everyone is agreed with it, even though, and I can see it already in the chat. I think it's worth it to ask whether it's actually true, and in which sense perhaps it is true, or what's true about it, and whether we actually our societies are really organized around this notion that the democracy needs science and that science needs democracy. So because I do actually think that that the scientific community is much less committed to any of these ideas when it comes to the question of sanctions. But also, I mean, this is a whole different ballgame and a very difficult ballgame, but also when it comes to the way in which to conduct a kind of scientific inquiries in the context of the Middle Eastern conflict. In the one case, we are sort of very prepared. It seems the scientific community is very prepared to simply accept the sanctions and to accept that there are certain things that are not allowed anymore and that you shouldn't even wish for, and even to the point where certain maybe scientific problems cannot be posed and addressed anymore in the way that we are used to. So there seems to be quite a bit of acceptance. So of course, everyone here in attendance clearly accepted from that, and that's one thing. But also there's some kind of some degree of acceptance that we also have to, you might say, self-censor ourselves a bit when it comes to very delicate questions about understanding what's going on in the Middle East, because there is the suspicion that to understand is also at the same time already to excuse and to legitimize maybe terrorist activities and so forth. And if we want to kind of stay clear of this kind of slippery slope, and we are the scientific community at large seems to be quite cautious here, and willing to step back rather than assert itself for the kind of creating a space of reasoning that the science is in some sense responsible for and known for. So there is a bit. So there is a bit of. So I'm personally very distraught by that, you might say, because even though I've been myself as an analyst of so-called techno-scientific research, I've been sort of looking at the changes in the culture of research, and clearly there is perhaps less of a sort of commitment to traditional scientific values as we work in much more sort of innovation oriented contexts. But at the same time, I was still disappointed that even this sort of rhetorical sort of self-understanding of science doesn't seem to be virulent anymore. I noticed there are lots of interesting discussions going on in the chat, but I can't read them along while I'm speaking. So if you think it's something that should be used to disrupt or to just interrupt me, feel free to do that. So what we've been trying to do, after we didn't spend too much time in Koblenz lamenting the current situation, but we really wanted to kind of find out how to counter this skeptical attitude of science, or maybe this restraint, or this silent acceptance of certain restrictions on scientific activity. So we wanted to see how we can counter this by reflecting, in some sense, by engaging in a kind of soul searching, you might say, looking at the roots of science and engineering, or the historical traditional roots of the self-understanding of science. And so if we go back now to the two parts of the slogan that I mentioned. So there's, on the one hand, science needs democracy. Let's turn to this one first, which is maybe the more familiar of the two, right? When we say science needs democracy and democracy needs science, science needs democracy is actually a fairly well established sort of notion in the history of scientific thinking, in the philosophy of science, but also in the kind of public self-presentation of science. And of course, with democracy, I mean, we don't have to look at a very particular political theory here. I think what it means ultimately is that science addresses the global public, that it is part of a global public, and to be in some sense in a public setting means that you have to adopt certain kinds of standards of respect, of critical exchange of arguments, and so forth and so on, and that this public form of argumentation is not in some sense structured by privilege or hierarchy, but that somehow we all come together as equals, and that also we all share our insights, our ideas, our goods, make them available to each other, right? These are sort of core ideas about the constitution of science. I think we can go back to Immanuel Kant if we want. There's, of course, Karl Popper, who has often been cited still as a philosopher of science, who speaks about science as a model for an open society. There's our German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas. But perhaps the one person who best articulated this was Robert Merton, who in the 1940s, in the light of totalitarianism in Russia and Germany, in the 1940s, tried to spell out what he called the ethos of science, and two of the four basic norms of science that he identifies are, on the one hand, what he calls universalism, And universalism means that science doesn't exclude anyone on the basis of gender or ethnicity or national adherence or whatever, that everyone can sort of participate in the game of producing arguments and presenting evidence and critiquing each other. So universalism as one of those norms, and the other norm he called in the 1940s communism, and that was the norm that speaks about shared property, that there is that you don't have private ownership of scientific ideas, but that in the scientific community there is a kind of public property. So we have all these. These basic ideas, and they I think very deeply embedded in the self-understanding of science. And I think, of course, they have very clear implications for our discussions today. This is not so much about science as peace building, but as being a kind of forum in which we peacefully interact with one another, and where in some sense you might say we rehearse what it means to be peacefully and respectful of one another, right? So let me just leave it at that. And of course, we might ask, why is this idea forgotten, or is it forgotten in the current discussions about sanctions, and whether or not we should collaborate scientifically with colleagues in China or Russia and maybe elsewhere. Well, there's actually someone asking a question, so please go ahead and interrupt me. Mm-hmm.
Michaela, you want to ask a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Alfred, for your remarks about the link between science and democracy. Let me add some more thing about that. In my opinion, the link between science and democracy is the fact that the science develop the critical thinking, because it's based on scientific method, and that allow to eliminate the fake news. And in the public life, the fake news today, they play a big role. So this is a big value for the democracy, and it is not stressed enough. Sometimes it's even ignored in the society. Yeah. That is what I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And in fact, I will speak just about that in a minute. Yes, you're quite right about this. I should just add one more thing, perhaps. I mean, there is. I mean, some of you may have read the statement by all the Nobel laureates. I think it came out last week or so. 142 Nobel laureates getting together and also expressing their strong solidarity for Ukraine, which makes perfect sense. But they also indicate in there that somehow Russia forfeits its sort of right, you might say, to be part of this global public of science. And the argument they make is that and there is, of course, some evidence for this very clearly. The argument they make is that by breaking the rules of this kind of democratically constituted public sphere, where we critique each other, critical thinking, and also respect that comes with that, that this is actually also, of course, undermined by Russian research and science itself. And there is, of course, some truth to that. I mean, some people say, for example, that Arctic research is not possible now because, I mean, even though 60% of the Arctic is controlled by Russia, because of the sanctions, it's very hard to collaborate and exchange data. But on the other hand, it's also true that there is a long prehistory of this, and that the quality of Arctic research has deteriorated over the years, even before the sanctions were imposed. So there is, of course, some question of what happens when a scientific community itself seems to, you might say, almost disqualify itself from a kind of public discussion. And I think that makes it very complicated. Personally, I would think that it's still the gesture of invitation still has to be made. So if you want to join the game of being one of those who engage in this kind of critical exchange and critical mutual questioning and the kind of public generation of knowledge in a cosmopolitan way, right? If you want to be part of this, then I think the doors should always be open. I mean, whether this means that funds have to be invested and so forth is a different question. But in general, I think the spirit of science, I think, demands that we do not, from our point of view, so to speak, exclude anyone. So this is the first part of the story. The second part, I'll try to be very quick because I promised to be almost over. The second part of the story is this other part of the slogan, where it says not only that science needs democracy, but that democracy needs science. And of course, that is a much harder claim to make in the end. But the notion here is that scientific and maybe also engineering research promotes a kind of the idea of a kind of globality, of a kind of global community, a kind of a peaceful way of living together, maybe within a country, but also between countries. So here it's not so much about what it takes to produce good theories and how to find the truth, and that we therefore that for that we need to be kind of open and critical and need a kind of global community. Here it is really more about how the research practices themselves are in some sense peaceful practices and rehearse, you might say, or give demonstrations of the possibility of productive cooperation. And I think this part has not been so much reflected on, and it's harder to articulate just what it is. So how is it that the research itself has a kind of peace promoting sort of quality, aside from the fact that people meet and engage and we kind of see each other, that we are friendly people who don't reject each other on the basics of our cultural affiliations, but that we respect each other for who we are and what we can contribute. So but beyond that, what is it that the especially also kind of maybe engineering oriented, systems oriented kind of research can deliver? And here I'm turning a little bit towards a philosopher who is not so well known internationally, but quite well known in Germany. His name is Alexander Kluge, and he speaks a lot about, actually it ties in with what was just said, what he would call Sachlichkeit, kind of Sachverstand. And it's very hard to translate Sachlichkeit because it's not the same thing as objectivity, but it has something to do with being attuned, having a kind of sense of how things work in context, how a system works, how things have to play together so that they can, without violence, so to speak, kind of make a system run. So if you have let's say a machine, an engine, for example, let's say always the best kind of example, right? There are many parts that have to work together, a kind of interplay of things. And of course, when people come in to work with these machines, it becomes an interplay of people and things. And this interplay has to be, in some sense, smooth. It has to be, you have to reduce friction. If you force things, they will break sooner or later, right? So there is this whole notion that one needs a certain kind of attentiveness, a kind of attunement, a kind of sensibility for the working order of things, and this is not the kind of detached, cold objectivity that looks from afar, but it is rather a kind of intimacy, sort of, that tends to the specific qualities of things or people, and for the elements of a system, as they work together. So it gives you a kind of sense of precision, of Sachlichkeit, also in the sense of de-emotionalizing issues, of describing them in their kind of functional relationship to each other, and it produces a kind of knowledge about what's the right moment to intervene, when should I stay back, a kind of notion of tact, and it could produces on the one hand a kind of collaborative spirit, but one that works not by sort of ideological force. So we are not, you might say, uniting around central concepts or beliefs, but we unite around sort of the interest in this kind of making things work together. And this, of course, will have an effect already regarding fake news and things like that, but it also has an effect by way of, in some sense, undermining some of the political rhetoric that often attends conflict. So talking about Russia, Ukraine right now, from my point of view, what I've witnessed is that there's a kind of discourse in Russia now, increasingly, about somehow needing to defend their own culture, and that somehow they have to defend themselves for who they are, because everyone is ganging up against them, and so forth and so on. And at the same time, we have here on this side a kind of discourse that is very much framed in almost religious terms of good and evil, where in fact, of course, we might say that we are talking about sovereignty of countries, we are talking about self-determination, we are talking about the use of violence and the appropriateness of violence, and so forth. These are, you might say, almost technical issues in a good sense of the word, right? And to use to kind of bring things back to notions of what is, in some sense, the right way to interact in a kind of international sphere of global law, right? And how to basically negotiate questions of proportionality, and so forth. So one cannot. So it is really about respect of sovereignty, for example, as a value, and so forth. So it's so in some sense, I think the scientific mindset, you might call it, which is perhaps a more technical mindset, can also de-emotionalize the issues to the point where one can say where one can still come to the same bottom line in terms of the analysis of who's right and wrong, but the right and wrong is maybe of a different kind. It's the wrong behavior because it has it's politically wrong, it's legally wrong, it's morally wrong, but we don't need to invoke notions of evil, for example, or the notion of cultures at war to talk about these kinds of rights and wrongs. So this might be one way in which, of course, there's a kind of sobering aspect that comes with a technical and scientific discussion and discourse. There's a kind of culture of, you might say, friendly or appreciative speech, which we practice in scientific contexts. And the last point I would like to make, and thereby also wrap up, is that this also, and I think this cannot be underestimated, the role of scientific collaboration and technical collaboration is also to, in some sense, create a sense of possibility of peaceful cooperation, and this is easy to forget, that there is even such a sense of possibility, that this possibility even exists. And this has to do with, if I cite a kind of philosophical theory here, but philosophers who speak about pandemics or notions of crisis and war, some of them have found out that the first thing that gets lost in a pandemic or in a war is your belief in the possibility of a future that is open. we basically become, the world around us seems to close up in many ways. We are not fully alive. We are in some sense experience ourselves as lucky to be alive, or maybe even experience ourselves as sort of not yet dead. And we kind of experience the world in a kind of somewhat zombie-like way. We can hope, of course, for the end of the war or the end of the pandemic, but we don't even really dare to imagine what a future beyond the war might look like, or how relationships between countries will look like in the future, and so forth. So this loss of imagination, you might say, that comes with notions of crisis and pandemic and war, this loss of imagination, I think scientific and technical sort of engagement with one another sort of counteracts that. Sort of it opens up a space for possibility, and I think that's another important, I think, reason why we have to hold on at least to the idea of this kind of possibility and this kind of cooperation. All right, so maybe I should just stop here, because I also noticed that there are some others who would like to join in and with critical comments.